Looks like Traven and Maggie just walked in. We are in Esther chapter 9 this morning. The goal is to conclude our study of Esther today and begin our summer series Sunday morning style next Sunday morning. I understand we're going to move back down to the lower level next Sunday morning. Is that correct, Kurt? I just heard that this past week, and I was confirming it. Michael Morgan is shaking yes. So our educational director informs us that we're going to be back down there. So Dennis, you'll be on the floor next Sunday morning and not up here, unless you'd prefer to be up here and just ignore Michael. Doesn't matter to me. Now in the 12th month, which is the month Adar. Adar is the Hebrew calendar, and it corresponds to our mid-February to mid-March. When we began our study early in March, the Jews had just celebrated the Feast of Purim, which originated, as you probably already know, with the book of Esther and the deliverance of Esther's people from the threat that Haman had concocted to eliminate the entire race. And because of her intercession, an additional decree was made that gave them the authority to defend themselves, and as a result, their enemies were destroyed. They were not, and this led to the celebration of Purim. On the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, this is the command and edict which Haman had originated, persuaded the king to authorize, which said, on a certain day determined by casting lots, the Jews were to be destroyed. The laws of the Mede and Persians, as you know, once made, could not be unmade. And therefore, in order to deliver the Jews from what would have been certain destruction, Mordecai had to devise a way under the authority of the king to prevent Haman's decree from being carried out. And that's what chapter 9 is all about. The edict was about to be carried out on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them. The reverse occurred. The Jews gained the mastery over those who hated them. Mordecai's response to the first decree was a second decree which said to the Jews, you are authorized to kill your enemies. Those who seek to kill you, you may yourself kill. And this was simply a self-defense piece of legislation that says you don't have to just stand there and take it. You can defend yourselves. You can kill those who seek to kill you. It was the only way that it seems Mordecai could consider an appropriate response to Haman's decree. And I, as you have read this so many times over the last 3 months, and I am at a loss to think of any other remedy myself. The only possibility, since the first decree could not be overturned, was to give a second decree that allowed the Jews to defend themselves and to, in fact, kill those who sought to kill them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. There are 127 such provinces in the nation of Persia at this time. The borders of the empire were extensive. They included southern Africa down into Kush or Ethiopia, all the way through India. And so everywhere Jews were settled, and that was pretty much everywhere there was a population, they seemed to find their way there, set up business, and actually prosper. They had to be warned. The message had to go out, you can defend yourselves. No one could stand against them, the text says, for fear of them had fallen on all the people. They had started out in great fear themselves because they were under a death sentence. But after Mordecai has originated a response that has circulated throughout the empire, the tables have turned, and now it's the Jews that are greatly feared. All the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. Now, as you read further and find the Jews overcame their enemies, and though many of their enemies were destroyed, there's no record of a single Jew having lost his or her life. The reason seems to be implied here that they had the government on their side. And if you revolted against the Jews, not only would you incur their wrath and their self-defense mechanisms, you would also incur the wrath of the empire, because the second most powerful man in the land is himself a Jew. And you know on which side of this issue Mordecai falls. And politicians are typical politicians. I don't care if you're talking about 2,500 years ago or yesterday. They know what to do as a means of self-preservation. They understood which side they needed to be on, and they chose to side with the Jews because it was politically expedient. And that's just how politicians, by and large, work. Not every political person is a politician. Some are public servants. And I want to make that distinction because there are people who simply serve in an office because they want to serve their communities. And I don't think this is an overgeneralization. By and large, they're there for themselves. Especially the higher up you go, the more that seems to be the case. All you need to do is watch what plays out in Washington or in Columbus, and it becomes apparent in a hurry if your eyes are open. And these folks have got their eyes open, and they can read the political winds. They're siding with the Jews, which makes their ability to defend themselves a whole lot easier than it otherwise would be. And the text says it's because they understand who Mordecai is. He has the king's ear. He's the second most powerful man throughout the land, and they don't want to cross him. So they don't. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. Every time I read chapter 9, I read it earlier this morning, and I couldn't help, as I typically do, reflecting on a similar story in Genesis. It begins in chapter 37, and it really doesn't conclude until chapter 50. It's all about Joseph, with the exception of chapter 38. And Joseph is someone who goes from obscurity to the second most powerful position in Egypt. And his fame was known throughout Egypt. Everywhere throughout the land, the stories were told about him. The same thing has occurred in relationship to Mordecai. As a result of this second decree, the record says the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. The original legislation had given permission for the enemies of the Jews to eradicate the entire populace. Man, woman, child were all fair game. The Jews were to be completely destroyed. The second decree gave the Jews the right to do the same toward their enemies. Men, women, and children were all fair game, but as you look at the story and how it unfolds, no women or children are harmed by the Jews. Though they had authority to do so, they chose not to do it. And I think it's very simple. The women and children were not involved in the attacks on the Jewish populace. And the Jews only sought to eliminate those who sought to eliminate them, and that was men. And so the men will perish who seek to destroy Jews. The women and children will be spared. A second thing that the first decree allowed was the enemies of the Jews to essentially take all of the plunder. They would take as their possession. In fact, it would ultimately, most of it, find its way into the coffers of the king, any valuables the Jews had. So the second decree gave the Jews the same right to plunder their enemies. But again, they did not exercise that right. This was not about taking territory or taking things. It was about self-preservation. You look at what's going on over in the Ukraine today, that's about taking land and about destroying things. And they don't really care, men, women, children. You get in the way, you get run over. The Jews in this particular situation are not motivated by the same things. They just want to protect themselves and their families. The record says in Susa, the citadel or capital, and this would be the winter residence of the king, as we've mentioned already, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also killed Parshandatha and Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmasta, Erisai, Eridai, and Vasatha. Now these are the sons of Haman. He had 10. And in addition to the 500 who are killed, these 10 are eliminated, and they are specifically named. And I think there's obvious reason why this would be the case. I don't think anyone would dispute the fact that these 10 fellows really have it in for the Jews. Right now, Mordecai lives in their house, their daddy's home. He has oversight over the entire estate because when Haman was killed, his entire estate was given as a gift to Esther, and Esther immediately moved her cousin Mordecai into the residence. And when she was given the estate, that would include everything in it, all of the furnishings, all of the servants, anything of real value which Haman had became the property of Esther, who entrusted it to Mordecai. These fellows are just thrust out. Can you imagine how they must have felt? I suspect that their anger and hatred may have not risen to the same level as their dad, but it was getting very close. And so you know they're going to be a part of this effort to destroy the Jews, and more than anything else, like their father, they would want Mordecai dead, but it's not going to happen. So the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they laid hands on no plunder. They just eliminated those who sought to eliminate them. It's called self-defense. Do you think self-defense is still appropriate in modern America? I know people who don't think, as a Christian, that it is, but I am really hard-pressed as I read the Bible to find anything that would suggest that Christians are called to just stand by and watch others being abused or themselves abused or murdered without at least making an effort to defend themselves. And I realize that Jesus said those who live by the sword shall die by the sword, but one who simply exerts self-defense, is he or she living by the sword? I don't think so. They're just using common sense to do what any right-thinking person would do, and not just stand by and allow others to destroy you or your family or even your possessions for that matter. If someone is breaking into your home and you're fearful, you are within your rights, from what I read in Scripture, to defend yourself. Now, if you don't share that conviction, I am not here to persuade you to change. You need to honor your conscience. But if you're breaking into my house and I can prevent it, I'm going to prevent it. and I have no pangs of conscience otherwise. This is what they're doing, exercising self-defense. So we have 500 in the capital plus the sons of Haman, making 510. But the story is not over yet in Susa, the capital. That very day, the number of those killed in Susa, the citadel, was reported to the king. You can imagine his interest. What's happening? We've got these conflicting decrees. Who's winning? And what's the total? And he discovers that in his own capital, 500 men have been killed, plus the sons of Haman. So the king said to Queen Esther, "In Susa the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? If this is what's true in the capital, what has happened throughout the empire?" It's a fair question. It's an extensive empire, large population. How many others have faced a similar fate? But then he says, "Now what is your wish? It shall be granted you, and what further is your request, it shall be fulfilled." So the king clearly has grown closer to Queen Esther. The first time she encountered him to deal with this matter, she was fearful for her own life. Now it seems that that has passed, and the king is wondering, what else can I do? What is your heart's desire, so to speak? Is there any other steps we need to take? And Esther said, "If it please the king." Notice she doesn't say you need to do this. She says only if it is pleasing in your sight. If it seems appropriate to you, if it doesn't create greater problems, then this is what I'd like. Let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. The edict which demanded that the enemies of the Jews carry out the death sentence on a certain day had been countermanded by a similar edict that enabled them to defend themselves on a certain day. She says, when the king says anything else, well, in the capital itself, can we have another day? So clearly she's under the impression that everyone who needed to die isn't dead yet. There must still be a sizable force in the city that seeks Mordecai and the Jews' death, and that by implication would be her own death as well. We need a little more time. And furthermore, let the sons of Haman, however, be hanged on the gallows. Remember when we talked about Haman preparing gallows and how he intended that to be the fate of Mordecai, that I told you the Persians do not hang folks at this point in history. They impale them, and the word that is translated gallows is not accurately translated because it simply means wood, perhaps a wooden spike on which someone would be impaled. Now, it was 75 feet tall, probably erected on the wall of the city, so it would be visible to anyone in any of the surrounding area. Coming into town, in town, on the wall itself, you probably would at some point be exposed to this. And Haman's thought was, this will send a message. This was what happens to people who cross me. But he ended up on that gallows himself, impaled. And she says, I want his sons displayed in a similar manner. And I know it seems really gruesome, but you read Old Testament history in particular, and if you read secular history outside of the New Testament, you're going to find that these kinds of things are not uncommon. The brutality it's just on display for all to see. The Assyrians who conquered the northern kingdom of Israel bragged about how they would pile the skulls of their victims on top of each other until the skulls made mountains. And obviously, mountains in the sense that we think of them is not what's intended, but rather substantial hills, and we don't have any children in here, they flayed their victims and used the skins of those they have killed, tanned them and used them like we would use cowhide. And it's just beyond my comprehension, but this is the world of the Old Testament, and sadly, the world through most of the history of human civilization. The battles fought in the Crusades, in the Middle Ages were brutal. They were face-to-face, hand-to-hand combat. By the Middle Ages, they had bows and arrows, of course, like they did in the Old Testament, but it was primarily people coming together, and they just wailed away at each other. And it's a gruesome picture. So what we look at and just kind of shake our heads in disbelief was not uncommon. And you get to the New Testament and crucifixion, which was the Roman means of execution, as impaling was the Persian means, was not at all uncommon. We look at the story of Jesus and the thieves at his right and left and forget that this story was played out over and over and over again throughout the empire. And when the Romans invaded in 70 A.D. and destroyed Jerusalem, the crosses were so plentiful that the wood had been depleted in and around Jerusalem. It's estimated that over 1 million Jews were crucified by the Romans at that time. And it's just a horrendous sight to contemplate, but this was life in ancient history. So she says, I'd like those 10 sons impaled as well, or hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa, but they laid no hands on the plunder. So the total now is 810 men killed in Susa, the citadel. And the next question, which will soon be answered, is how many more throughout the empire? Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. Now some biblical scholars questioned this number, saying that seems terribly large, that's a wholesale slaughter that the critics think indefensible. Interestingly, if you read the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, done in Alexandria, that's in Egypt, northern coast of Africa, the record says 15,000. And there's the probability that those translators who were going from Hebrew to Greek saw something that caused them to question the 75,000, and they in turn translated it 15,000. And I don't know which is true. Most English translations say 75,000. In an empire the size of the Medo-Persian Empire, that's still a drop in the bucket compared to the overall population. But the death of 75,000 outside of Susa, the capital, that's pretty serious business. 15,000, it seems to me to be pretty serious business. But this is what happened throughout the empire. This was on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made that a day of feasting and gladness. So what happens is, after they have succeeded on the day that they were to be slaughtered in slaughtering their enemies, they follow that up the next day with a great celebration in which there is essentially a declared holiday for them. There's feasting. They contribute to the poor. They exchange gifts, the kinds of things that we would think of in terms of a holiday and how it's celebrated. This happened everywhere except in the capital of Susa. There, on the 14th day, we have a second day in which the Jews defend themselves, and an additional 300 men are killed. And so we'll learn as the record continues that in the capital, the Jews there celebrated on the 15th, but everywhere else throughout the empire they celebrated on the 14th because they completed their task on the day that was designated, the 13th, but in Susa, the capital, an additional day was required. The king agreed to Esther's request, and so they delayed their celebration until the following day. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th day and rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day of gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. So this is how they observed their deliverance. They declared it a national holiday, and they engaged in the kinds of things that we typically do. I suspect many of you have planned cookouts for the Memorial Day weekend at some point, yesterday, today, or tomorrow. People get together and they turn on the grill and they serve hot dogs and hamburgers and potato salad and, you know, all of the normal fixings. That's how we observe holidays. It really hasn't changed. The types of food we serve may vary from culture to culture, but the typical way of expressing things is pretty much the same. And they continue this practice to the present. When you look at Judaism, you really do look at a holiday religion. They had their 3 central feasts, plus this additional Feast of Purim. They had festivals for new moons, the changing of the months, and various and sundry other things. And they were big deals. The church began on one of those holidays, the Pentecostal holiday, the Feast of Pentecost, which came on the first Sunday following 7 Sabbaths after the observance of the Passover. Pentecost means 50th. And so they had a feast for the Passover holiday and followed it up 7 weeks later with another holiday called Pentecost. And it was then that, as we learn in Acts 2, the church became a reality. One of the things that Paul does in his epistles, primarily to the Galatians and the Colossians, but it's hinted at elsewhere, is to remind readers that Christianity is not a holiday religion. It has become, I think, in many ways a holiday religion, where sadly a number of folks who profess to be Christians only have their religion in December and April, or Christmas and Easter. They get all dressed up and they make a show of things at those 2 times of the year, and the remainder of the year they concern themselves very little. And that really is a carryover from Judaism, the holiday religion that the Jews practiced with all of their celebrations and everything that was inherent in them. I've made it a point over the years, when we typically have larger numbers at Christmas and Easter, not to insult people and just point it out, because I want them to come back, and I found that if you insult them, they typically don't. But I do try to underscore the fact that the sacrifice of Jesus, his birth and his crucifixion followed by his resurrection, ought to impact our lives every day, not just on holidays. And if you get a little more generous and are a little more patient, a little more understanding at Christmas, and a lot of people are, bottle that up and keep it with you the rest of the year as well. People need patience and kindness and consideration in July just like they do in December. And we need to think of the resurrection of Jesus, the greatest miracle in the Bible, every day, not just on Easter, which is a holiday that is not found anywhere in the New Testament. And yes, I am aware of the translation in Acts 12 where Pascha, the Greek word for Passover, is mistakenly translated Easter, done by the translators because they wanted people to be able to identify with the time of year in which it occurred, because as we've said before, the crucifixion of Jesus and his resurrection take place around the Passover feast, and so it gives you a time frame for when it happened, but that's not translation. And sadly, many people do not avail themselves of material that will help them understand what the record actually says. The same thing was done in relationship to baptism. Rather than translate the word bapto or baptismos or baptizo with immerse, submerge, they chose to transliterate because they knew that if they were to be fair with the translation, it would destroy practices that were in 1611 universally accepted of sprinkling and pouring. A fair translation of Scripture would destroy that. So they refused to translate, they transliterated. There is no doubt about the meaning of the word in the original, but today you ask the average person on the street, they'll tell you first, baptism isn't essential. It's a good thing and you can do it, but it's not necessary to get to heaven. And by the way, you can choose how. You can have water sprinkled on you, poured on you, or you can be immersed. But that's not what the Bible teaches. But I move on. So, we've got this holiday in Susa on the 15th, everywhere else in the empire on the 14th, and it will be carried out annually. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies by destroying them, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another, and gifts to the poor. And that final phrase, and gifts to the poor, seems so appropriate because as you go through the record of Israel's history, you'll find God repeatedly telling them to treat strangers among them with hospitality because they were strangers in a foreign land. And they are repeatedly reminded as God's people that they are to be cognizant of the needs of the less fortunate and generous in helping, in particular, widows and orphans who are singled out, as they are in James chapter 1, as worthy of benevolence or good deeds. And they were to carry this out in terms of the celebration of this holiday. Not only was it a time for them to get together and feast, it was a time for them to reflect on their blessings and to share those blessings with the people around them. And I have reminded you in the past, when the Bible talks about hospitality, it does so in an entirely different context than how we typically use the word today. We think being hospitable is opening our homes to our friends and neighbors and family. And we have people in, and we sometimes serve food, desserts, offer everybody a beverage. When I grew up, the first thing you were asked when you came to visit was, "You want a cup of coffee?" It was just everybody seemed to drink coffee, and it was the appropriate thing to do, to be hospitable. But the word that is generally translated hospitable literally means being a lover of strangers. It's showing those kinds of things to people that you don't know, that you may never see again, but they are creatures made in the image of God, and as people of God, we are to show them consideration and kindness. And so that's the idea of hospitality. you go over to Hebrews and you read about how some entertained angels unawares. And the point that the writer is making is not that somebody might be knocking at your door, a stranger, unrecognizable to you, who is an angel in disguise. That's not what the text is saying. The text is saying that in the past, people were hospitable to strangers, and in the process, actually on occasion, entertained angels. And the two examples that immediately come to mind are Abraham and Manoah. Abraham entertained the angels, not realizing they were angels at the time. He was simply showing hospitality. He stood at the door of his tent and he saw them approaching, and immediately he just rolled out the red carpet, so to speak. They were strangers, and the appropriate thing to do was to show them hospitality. And Manoah and his wife did the same thing. They were the parents of Samson, if you didn't recall. They showed the angel hospitality. We should treat everybody as though they're a messenger of God and show them the same kind of hospitality. And that's true in a setting like this. When people come in that you do not recognize, your first response ought to be to introduce yourself and welcome them and let them know that we're happy to see them. It's the appropriate response. Yes, you do run the rare chance that you will introduce yourself to somebody who's been here longer than you have, because sadly we only tend to know the people right around us and don't make an effort to get to know the whole family. Shame on us for that. But I'd rather introduce myself to somebody that I've met a dozen times than to miss the person I haven't met before, and let them know that we're grateful for their presence and want them to come back, and if there are things we can do to help, we will do our best. That's what being hospitable is really all about. And when they gave gifts to the poor, they were being hospitable. These were not family members, close friends. These were just folks who didn't have what others had, and those who had shared with those who had not. That does not mean, however, that you drop something off every time you go to Walmart to the panhandler out there who makes his living that way. He's taking advantage, and I refuse to be taken advantage of that way. Help people genuinely in need, but don't let the abusers succeed by being a facilitator. Sometimes it's hard to know, I agree. But we've got to do our best. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, the Agagite, and the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast pur, that is, cast lots. This is just a repetition of everything that we have learned thus far, to crush and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that his son should be hanged on the gallows. And we just read about her request that this be done for the 10 sons of Haman as well. Therefore, they called these days Purim, after the term pur. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter and of what they had faced in this matter and what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written and at the time appointed every year. Now, remember, they have firmly obligated themselves, but what did we discover in Nehemiah? They weren't real good at sticking to their promises. They had actually declared in writing their commitment to follow God's law to the letter and put their seals or their signatures on it to display the seriousness of it. And when Nehemiah went back home, they reverted to their old ways almost immediately. They did not always keep this feast. And by the way, the word pur, P-U-R, simply means lot. They cast pur, they cast lots. So they're committed to keeping this feast annually. that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants, which was supposedly true of the Passover, of Pentecost, of the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall, the Feast of Harvest, but they weren't real good at honoring that. So chapter 9 wraps up. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority confirming this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews of the 127 provinces and the kingdom of Ahasuerus in the words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their feast or their fast and their lamenting. The command of Queen Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. I don't know if this is recorded in writing in the annals of the Medes and Persians. Remember, this whole story kind of unfolds the way it unfolds because the king can't sleep, and so he's up in the middle of the night and someone's reading to him the annals of his own administration, and there he discovers that Mordecai had actually saved his life and nothing had been done to reward him, and this set in motion a whole series of things that led to the outcome that we've just read about. So whether it's in the annals of the Medes and Persians, or it's this book that we've just about completed, or some other document, I don't know. It may be all of the above, for all I know. But there's certainly an historical record of everything that has taken place. That's chapter 9, which brings us to chapter 10. You say, oh no, we can't possibly get through chapter 10. Oh, but we can. Chapter 10, King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea. That's what kings do. I don't know if Mordecai suggested this particular tax, what brought it about, but the very next statement is, and all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? So we know that there is a record at this time in the Chronicles of the Medes and Persians relative to what Mordecai has done. And whether part of that is a record of this tax and perhaps his input in that, don't really know. But there must be some reason why this was included in the final chapter of the record. You look at the book of Chronicles, and if you're a Bible student, you'll know that the Jews had their own chronicles, a history of their monarchs. And we refer to those books as 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is just a historical record of the events in the lives of many of the kings of Israel and Judah. For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, just as Joseph had been second in rank to the Pharaoh in Egypt. He was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers. So he was highly respected, and for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. His popularity and the respect that people had for him is directly attributed to how he treated them, with respect and with a desire always for their best interest and peace. And Esther has concluded, and Mrs. Forshee has her finger on the buzzer, but it's not quite time yet. But we're done, so we're quitting even though she hasn't hit the bell. And you can get ready now for the next period of worship by getting up, walking around, and saying hello to everybody. Have at it.